Alright, so I just moved the empty buckets over so they're closer to me. So I have half a pound of water, 1 pound of water, 2 pounds of water, and now I need to make their counterparts in plaster silica. We're going to mix or put the dry plaster and the dry silica in the same bucket. So if we have half a pound of water in here, then I do half a pound of plaster and half a pound of silica. So the whole bucket should end up weighing 1 pound. Zero it out. Scoop up my plaster. I'll do my best not to dump it on the floor. Not a big deal if a little gets there. Now my assistant is also masked up, so we're totally safe. And I'm going to sprinkle some plaster in here, and I'm just looking for that halfway mark again. Going slow. And we're there. And then silica. And now, because I'm already at the halfway mark, I'm looking to add another half pound, so I'm looking for the 1 pound mark. Oh, not quite enough. Great. We're going to mix our second layer now. This was 1 pound of water, so it's going to be 1 pound of plaster and 1 pound of silica. Notice that I close the lids before or after I use them so I don't mix the materials. It's okay if your hands are a little dirty. A little bit of mixture is fine. I just don't want to accidentally dump like a scoop of plaster into the silica and vice versa. It is zeroed, and I'm looking for the 1 pound notch. That looks good. And then we're going to the 2 pound notch with the silica. Try to have a relationship with precision, but don't chase them like they're your biggest crush and they're running away from you. It's fine to sort of dance around precision with this. And then bigger bucket needs to get zeroed out. 2 pounds of water, 2 pounds plaster, 2 pounds silica for a total of 4 pounds. All right. The last thing that we're going to do before we start mixing the plaster and silica with the water is stir up each of the plasters and silicas. So you're pre-mixing the dry ingredients. And it's just a little like stir with your hands. I want you to sort of use one of your fingers and scrape into the corner gently just to pull up. it'll allow for your plaster silica slurry to be much more silky and without lumps. Great. All right, so it is time to mix. So I'm going to move the layers of plaster silica that I'm not using and their adjoining waters over to the side, just so I don't get confused. And I'm just going to mix my face coat. You never mix your plaster silica until you're ready to use it. So the rest is just prep. When you mix plaster silica, it is always, 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 and maybe Madeline can put this on the screen, it is always dry into wet. Never the other way around. So very similar to the alginate. Always dry materials into wet. So you're going to take your dry plaster silica that's been mixed together, and all in one go, you're just going to dump it in your measured out water, and then you're going to wait. This is a really great vocabulary word that you're going to learn right now. What you're going to do is let it slake, S-L-A-K-E. You have dumped your plaster silica in the water, and then you're going to let it slake for 3 minutes. Slaking is the action of the water through capillary action, snaking its way into the different plaster silica molecules and swelling them with water. If you don't let your plaster silica slake, it's not a huge deal, but it means that that you're sort of mixing dry into wet, so it will be more lumpy. The dry and the wet will stay dry and wet separated longer. If you let it slake, it kind of turns into this delicious mud, and then you're just stirring mud to get rid of the lumps. It'll make a lot of sense when you have hands in the material, but trust me, those 3 minutes of slaking are really good friends of yours. While I'm letting it slake, this isn't dirty, but I'm just going to rinse it. I don't have to even rinse it in my slop bucket. I can just rinse it in the sink, and then I'm just going to leave it over next to the sink so I can give it a little soap right at the end before I let it dry. So I'm going to bring my slaking plaster silica over to my table, and I'll meet you over there. All right, so you can see that the mixture, the slurry, is sort of totally slaked, which means that you don't see any powder anymore. And then I'm going to mix it with my hand. Again, if you don't want your hands to get plaster silica on them, you're welcome to put on a well-fitting pair of rubber gloves. A too loose pair will just make this process impossible, so make sure your gloves fit you well. And the action of stirring is going to be sort of this stir, grab, and lift. What I'm trying to do is not introduce a huge amount of air bubbles. So once I submerge my hands, and I can sort of come over here so you can see, I'm going to keep my hands submerged and just sort of gently stir, dragging my fingertips along the bottom of the bucket, feeling for any lumpy bumpies. Because we pre-mixed the plaster silica, I'm feeling pretty good about the mixture, and now I just want to make sure that the water is evenly dispersed. So I'll probably stir for about a minute. People have opinions about how long you should stir. I think that doesn't really matter right now. All right, so that looks pretty good. I'm just gonna feel for any extra lumps or bumps, and I don't feel any. And you can see that the plaster silica is really thin right now, super watery. And that is exactly the consistency that I want this first layer to go on as. So I'm gonna use my hand. I can also use a little cup from the consumables cabinet. And I'm just gonna drizzle plaster silica all over my object. Notice that I'm working away from the edge of the table. so I'm not dripping plaster silica on the floor. And it's gonna stay watery for a little while so I can work nice and slow. And like I mentioned before, you may have heard me say, this first coat is what I call a face coat. So it is really a detail layer. I am not trying to build up any strength or stability with this layer, but rather just adding a layer to catch all of the amazing detail that we've worked so hard to maintain, preserve, and create. So after that first sort of thin pour, I'm just gonna go over the whole object with my fingers, similarly to the way we used the hairspray, and I'm going to touch it all over. And what this is doing is twofold. One, it's getting all the plaster silica into all of the little cracks and crevices and pores and holes and weirdo spaces of my wax. And the second is that it is popping any bubbles that may have formed from the plaster silica hitting the wax. I'm shoving a little extra into these nostrils because they're undercuts, and then I'm using my fingers to pop the bubbles. And that looks pretty good. It's totally covered. And then I'm going to hang out until the plaster silica solidifies a little bit closer to like a thin milkshake, and I'm gonna add some more. So I have about I would say a 1/4 inch layer. Plaster silica has a variable setting point. It's not quite as specific as the alginate, which is exactly 8 minutes. Plaster silica the set point is dependent on the temperature of the water and also the other things that you add to it. So you can accelerate it by the amount of silica that you put in. You can accelerate it by the amount of plaster that you put in. So that's just a lot of words to say that there's no exact timing here. But we can pause the video and then we can come back when this plaster silica is sort of closer to the texture that I want it to be, so you don't have to wait with me. All right, we're back. I have this plaster silica which has stiffened up just a little bit. That was probably about 5 minutes waiting. I'm gonna give it a little bit of a stir in case any of the solid materials have settled to the bottom. And then I'm just gonna do another dribble. And you can see how it's grabbing onto the surface a little bit more. And then I'm going to touch it again. The face coat is the coat that you spend the most fussy time on. You really want to make sure that the plaster silica is evenly coated and all over. I'm going to pour out the rest of what I think I need. Obviously there's more than what I need on the cottle. And then I'm going to throw out the rest of my plaster silica while the plaster silica is still liquid in the container. So in the garbage bin, I'm going to pour out the plaster silica, the majority of it, right? So I'm not going to go crazy, but anything that's sort of still liquid that I can scrape goes into the garbage bin. And then I want to point out just how nice the bucket is with the Vaseline on it. You can really see that the plaster silica is skating over the surface. So when I go to clean it in the slop bucket, it's really just a rinse. I don't have to do any scraping or scrubbing. And this is because of the lubricant of the Vaseline, but it's also because I'm cleaning it while the plaster silica is still wet. If I let it harden in the bucket, that's definitely a scrapey scrubby, and you want to avoid that if you can. Rubbing into all of the places where the plaster silica likes to collect. So in the little ridge at the top of the bucket, and into the bottom and corners of the bucket. And then if I needed to mix any more plaster silica, and I didn't have any more buckets out, I could just reuse this bucket. But because I've already, pre-mixed my buckets, I'm just gonna toss this over by the sink to clean up before the end of the day. And in that time that I was waiting, the plaster silica on my cottle has really, really stiffened. And I'm just gonna finish up that surface layer by any place where I can still see the surface of the wax. I'm just gonna touch over. But just know you don't really need to totally obscure your object. It's just a face coat, just about a 1/4 inch of thickness. It is meant to be delicate. It has no strength. It is just taking on the texture of your object. So you're scooching some into this little narrow area, making sure that there's plaster up in that part that my fingers aren't readily touching. It's looking good. Any little sharp edges, I might just give a little bit extra, because those are more likely to break when I put my next layer on. So just a little bit of extra support on some of the edges. Boop, 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 boop. I'm just gonna get into the nostrils one more time, knowing that that's a spot where things might like to trap bubbles. Boop, boop, boop. And what you're witnessing now is the plaster really starting to stiffen quickly. So I'm going to stop working with it on my object, and it's time to clean my cup. I can wait until the plaster totally snaps and sort of scrape it up that way, but it's just as easy to take my scraper. I have my garbage bin next to my table, and I'm just scraping the plaster into the bin. And because we Vaselined up the cottle, it is cleaning up like a dream. And what I want to do is pull up the plaster so that first line is visible, because that is the line for the second layer. The first layer doesn't really need to extend out onto the cottle at all. So even if I reveal my sprue a little bit, that's fine. Because there's no detail on there that I care about catching. And then there's this big ugly lump here that I'm just gonna scrape off. All right, so I've removed the majority of the material, and now I'm just gonna give it a good cleaning scrape. And this will just make the building of the next layer that much easier if the cottle is clear of debris. And then I'll just give any plaster that's fallen onto the table also just a quick clean. All right. We are in excellent shape to mix our second layer. So I'm gonna rinse my hands off, pop my mask on, and I'll meet you over by the mixing station. All right, so we have our pre-mixed 1 pound plaster, 1 pound silica. That's been stirred together. And then we have our 1 pound of water. So remember, it's always dry into wet. Oh, let's turn the hood on. Great, so that's ready to be cleaned, so I'm just going to pop it over in the sink. And we're going to let this slake, and we can slake it over by our object, so I'll meet you back over there. Are we still recording?
Yes.
All right, so We're gonna let this slake for 3 minutes, but you can just, if you can point the camera in, what you can see, what you're looking for when you're slaking is that you should have this sort of mountain of powder. And if you look around the edges, you can see that the water is literally moving in and kind of climbing up into the mountain. That is the visualization of the slaking action. So waiting for 3 minutes will allow all of that water to sort of climb into the center of that mountain and really hydrate all of those particulates. So I'll see you in a few minutes. Great, we're all slaked up now. You can see, we'll just point it down. It's the same thing. The water has totally come and chewed into all of the dry particles and everything is nice and dry. I mean, wet. So I'm gonna come in with that same stirry, grabby motion and squeeze and stir until I have this really beautiful, evenly thick slurry. If there's any powder on the side of the bucket, you can sort of incorporate that as well. Taking care to sort of pull up any thick spots or not quite combined spots on the bottom. And the more material you have, the slightly longer you're going to want to stir for. Really sort of stirring and squeezing and stirring and squeezing, feeling for any lumpy bumpies. Nice evenly mixed plaster silica is going to make a stronger mold. So I'm gonna wait to put this layer on until it's a little thicker than that really watery layer, because I'm not trying to capture any detail here. If I do trap a couple bubbles, they might actually give me a bit of structural stability. We can talk more about that if you have questions. And I don't want it to, it's gonna be a thicker layer, so I don't want to pour it all onto the coddle and then have to scrape it all up. So instead I'm going to wait until it's kind of the thickness of a thick milkshake. Not like a milkshake that you can stand a spoon up in. That's too thick. I need it still to be runny. Too thin. So if you want to pause and we'll come back, it'll probably only be about